The dust clouds rose like angry spirits from the desert floor as Maria running Valve pressed her small body against the canyon wall. Her dark eyes darted between the rocks above, searching for any movement that might signal danger. At 15, she had learned to read the desert like other girls her age read books in schoolhouses. Every shadow held meaning. Every sound carried a message of life or death. The Apache girl clutched a leather pouch to her chest, its contents more precious than gold to her people. Inside lay the sacred herbs her grandmother had gathered before the soldiers came. Before everything changed. Before her world became a nightmare of running and hiding, 3 weeks had passed since the massacre at Red Canyon. 3 weeks since she watched her family fall under the bullets of men who saw her people as nothing more than obstacles to their expansion westward. Maria had survived only because her grandmother pushed her into a hidden cave moments before the shooting began. Now, she was alone in a world that wanted her. Dead, the sound of horse hooves on stone made her freeze. Someone was coming up the narrow trail that led to her hiding spot. Maria had chosen this place carefully, a small alcove high in the canyon walls where few would think to look. But apparently someone had thought to look. She crept to the edge of her shelter and peered down. A lone rider moved slowly along the canyon floor, his horse picking its way carefully between the scattered boulders. The man wore the clothes of a cowboy, worn leather chaps, a battered hat, and the easy posture of someone who lived his life in the saddle. Most importantly, he wore no blue uniform. Maria had learned to fear the blue uniforms. Above all else, the rider stopped directly below her hiding place. He dismounted and walked to a small spring that bubbled from the rocks. His horse drank deeply while the man knelt and cupped water in his hands. As he lifted his head to drink, Maria caught sight of his face. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps 35, with weathered skin and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. A thick mustache covered his upper lip, and several days of beard stubble darkened his jaw. There was something about his movements that spoke of caution rather than aggression. The cowboy stood and looked around the canyon as if sensing he was being watched. His gaze swept the walls but passed over Maria's hiding place without stopping. She held her breath, afraid even the smallest sound might give her away. "Easy there, Belle," he murmured to his horse, a beautiful Palomino mare with intelligent eyes. "Something's got you spooked." The horse had indeed sensed Maria's presence. Belle's ears were pointed toward the canyon wall where the Apache girl hid, and she shifted nervously despite the calming water and shade. The man's name was Jake Morrison, though Maria had no way of knowing this. He had been riding the territory for 5 years, working cattle for various ranchers and keeping mostly to himself. Jake had seen enough of the world to know that trouble usually wore many faces, and lately those faces had been getting uglier. He had heard about the massacre at Red Canyon from a traveling merchant in the last town. The story made his stomach turn. Jake had known Apache families in his time, had even traded with some of them. They were people just like anyone else, trying to make their way in a world that seemed determined to crush them. The merchant had also mentioned rumors of survivors. A young Apache girl, possibly alone in the desert. The territorial governor had placed a bounty on any Apache found alive in the region. Dead or alive, the poster had read, though everyone knew which option the authorities preferred. Jake filled his canteens at the spring and prepared to mount his horse. He had been tracking water sources across the desert, mapping them in his mind for future use. This spring was a good one, clear and fast-flowing, the kind that would attract wildlife and travelers alike. As he swung into the saddle, a small stone tumbled from the canyon wall above. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the gun at his hip, then stopped. Whatever was up there, it wasn't very big. And it wasn't moving like a threat. He guided Belle a short distance down the canyon, then dismounted again behind a large boulder. Moving quietly, Jake climbed the rocky slope toward where the stone had fallen. His boots found purchase on the weathered sandstone as he worked his way upward. Maria saw him coming and knew she was trapped. The alcove had only one entrance, and the cowboy was climbing straight toward it. She could try to run, but where would she go? The desert stretched for miles in every direction. and she was already weak from 3 weeks of hiding and eating very little. She pressed herself against the back wall of the cave and waited. Jake reached the alcove and paused at its entrance. The space was small, barely large enough for one person, but it showed clear signs of recent occupation. A few personal belongings were scattered on the floor: a water gourd, some dried plants, a small blanket that had seen better days. "Hello?" he called softly. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." Maria remained silent, hoping somehow he might leave without finding her. Jake stepped into the alcove and immediately saw her. The Apache girl was pressed against the far wall, her eyes wide with fear but also defiant. She clutched something to her chest and looked ready to fight if necessary. For a long moment they simply stared at each other. Jake took in her appearance, thin from lack of food, her clothes torn and dusty, but her posture proud despite her obvious terror. She was just a child, he realized. A child who had been through hell. Maria studied the cowboy's face, looking for any sign of the cruelty she had come to expect from white men. Instead, she saw something she hadn't expected: compassion. "My name is Jake," he said quietly, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. "It's Jake Morrison. I'm not going to hurt you." Maria understood some English, though she rarely had occasion to use it. Her grandmother had insisted she learn, saying it might save her life someday. Perhaps this was that day. You are not soldier?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake shook his head. "No, I'm not a soldier. I'm just a cowboy trying to make an honest living." He gestured toward the desert beyond. "This is dangerous country for someone traveling alone. Especially for—" He didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what he meant. "Especially for an Apache girl with a price on her head." "I have nowhere to go," Maria said, surprising herself with her honesty. Something about this man made her want to trust him, though every instinct told her to remain wary. Jake considered his options. He could ride away and pretend he had never seen her. That would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. Getting involved with Apache refugees was a good way to end up on the wrong side of the territorial authorities. But looking at this frightened girl, Jake couldn't bring himself to abandon her. His own sister had been about the same age when she died of fever back in Missouri. The memory of Sarah's face had haunted him for years, driving him west in search of something he couldn't name. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was his chance to save someone when he couldn't save Sarah. "I might know a place," he said carefully. "A safe place, at least for a while. But it would mean trusting me." Maria's grip tightened on the leather pouch. Inside were the sacred herbs that represented everything left of her family, her culture, her identity. If she lost them, she lost the last connection to who she was. But if she stayed here, she would eventually be found by less friendly searchers. The soldiers were still looking for Apache survivors. She had heard their horses in the distance several times over the past few days. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because everyone deserves a chance to live free." Those words struck something deep in Maria's heart. Her people had always valued freedom above all else. It was why they had fought so hard. Why they had refused to accept life on the reservations. Where other tribes had been forced to go, she looked into Jake's eyes and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I will trust you," she said. Jake nodded slowly. "Then we need to move quickly. If I found you here, others can too." He gestured toward her few possessions. "Gather your things. We'll travel at night and rest during the day." As Maria collected her belongings, Jake began planning their route. There was a place he knew, hidden deep in the mountains where few white men ventured. An old Apache camp that had been abandoned years ago but might still offer shelter. It would be dangerous getting there, but staying here would be even more dangerous. The sun was beginning to set as they prepared to leave the canyon. Jake helped Maria down the rocky slope to where Belle waited patiently. The horse seemed to accept the Apache girl immediately, nuzzling her gently as Jake checked his supplies. "Can you ride?" he asked. Maria nodded. Her people were born to the saddle. though she hadn't been on a horse since the massacre. Jake helped her mount behind him, and she wrapped her arms around his waist. Still clutching the precious herb pouch, as they rode out of the canyon into the gathering darkness. Neither of them spoke about the danger they faced. The territorial authorities had made their position clear. Any Apache found in the region was to be captured or killed. Helping one escape was considered an act of treason, but Jake had made his choice and Maria had made hers. Together, they would face whatever shadows lay ahead. The desert night was alive with so. Dawn broke over the mountains in shades of gold and crimson as Jake guided Belle through a narrow pass between towering rocks. Maria had dozed fitfully during the night ride, her exhaustion finally overcoming her wariness of the stranger who had become her protector. Now she stirred as the first rays of sunlight touched her face. They had traveled nearly 30 miles from the canyon, following paths that Jake seemed to know by heart. The terrain had grown increasingly rugged as they climbed into the foothills, leaving the open desert behind for a landscape of pine trees and hidden valleys. "Where are we?" Maria asked, her voice hoarse from the dry night air. Jake pointed ahead to where the trail widened, into a small meadow surrounded by granite cliffs. "Safe, for now. There's water here and shelter. We can rest until nightfall." The meadow was indeed beautiful, fed by a clear stream that tumbled down from the peaks above. Wildflowers dotted the grass, and the air smelled of pine sap and mountain flowers. It was so different from the harsh desert that Maria felt tears spring to her eyes. Jake dismounted and helped her down from Belle's back. Maria's legs were stiff from the long ride, and she stumbled slightly before finding her balance. The cowboy pretended not to notice her weakness, busying himself with unsaddling the horse and setting up a small camp. "You should rest," he said, spreading his bedroll in the shade of a large pine. "I'll keep watch." Maria wanted to protest that she could take a turn standing guard, but her body betrayed her. She sank onto the bedroll and was asleep within minutes. Still clutching her grandmother's herb pouch, Jake watched her sleep and felt a familiar ache in his chest. She looked so young, so vulnerable. The resemblance to his sister Sarah was even stronger in sleep, when fear wasn't hardening her features. He wondered what Maria's life had been like before the massacre, whether she had been happy, whether she had dreamed of the future the way Sarah had. The sound of approaching horses shattered the morning peace. Jake was on his feet instantly, his hand on his gun as he counted the hoofbeats. 3 riders, maybe 4, coming up the trail they had just traveled. He shook Maria awake gently. "We have company," he whispered. Maria's eyes snapped open, immediately alert. She had learned to wake ready for danger. Jake helped her to her feet and led her to a cluster of boulders at the edge of the meadow where they could observe without being seen. The riders came into view. Moments later, 4 men in dusty clothes, all armed and looking like they meant business. Jake recognized the type immediately. Bounty hunters. Men who made their living tracking down fugitives and didn't much care whether their quarry was brought back alive or dead. The leader was a thin man with a scarred face and cold eyes. He dismounted and studied the ground where Jake and Maria had stopped to rest. Even from a distance, Jake could see him examining the tracks. "Fresh horse sign," the bounty hunter called to his companions. "And 2 riders, one of them light. Could be our Apache girl?" One of the other men, a heavy-set fellow with tobacco-stained teeth, spat into the dirt. "Trail's getting cold, Hawkins. We've been chasing ghosts for 3 days now." The scarred man named Hawkins straightened up, his eyes scanning the meadow. "She's out here somewhere. Governor's paying $500 for proof of death. That's enough to keep me interested." Jake felt Maria tense beside him. $500 was more money than most working men saw in a year. It would draw every hard case and desperado in the territory. "What if she's already dead?" asked a third hunter, a young man who looked barely out of his teens. "Desert might have taken her by now." Hawkins smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Then we find the body and collect our money. Dead Apache's the same as a live one to the governor." The bounty hunters spent nearly an hour searching the meadow, following tracks and looking for signs of recent passage. Jake had been careful to approach the clearing from the rocky stream bed, where Belle's hooves would leave no clear prints. But these men were experienced trackers, Finally, Hawkins remounted his horse and gestured for the others to follow. Trail goes cold here. They probably doubled back. We'll try the southern passes. The hunters rode away, but Jake waited a full hour before emerging from hiding. When they finally returned to their camp, Maria was shaking slightly. $500, she said quietly. That is much money. Jake nodded grimly. More than enough to keep them hunting. We need to reach the old camp before they figure out where we're headed. They broke camp quickly, Jake erasing all signs of their presence with practiced efficiency. The old Apache camp he had mentioned was still 2 days' travel away, deeper in the mountains where few white men had ever ventured. If they could reach it, they might have a chance to disappear completely. As they prepared to mount Bell for another day of travel, Maria touched Jake's arm. Why do you do this? The money. You could claim it yourself? Jake met her eyes steadily. Some things can't be bought or sold. A person's life is one of them. They rode hard that day, pushing Belle to her limits as they climbed higher into the mountains. The terrain was treacherous, with loose rock that could send a horse tumbling into the valleys below. But Jake knew these trails from his early days in the territory, when he had been young and foolish enough to prospect for gold in Apache country. Late in the afternoon, they came upon a sight that chilled them both. A small Apache family lay dead beside a burned wagon, their bodies already being claimed by scavengers. Jake quickly guided Belle past the scene, but not before Maria saw enough to confirm her worst fears. My cousin, she whispered, her voice breaking. That was my cousin Joseph and his family. They were trying to reach Mexico. Jake felt sick. The dead family represented everything wrong with the current situation in the territory. These people had been trying to escape, to find safety across the border. Instead, they had found bullets and fire. I'm sorry, he said, knowing the words were inadequate. Maria wiped away tears and straightened her shoulders. They are with the spirits now. But their deaths must not be for nothing. That night they camped in a cave high on a mountainside, the entrance hidden behind a waterfall that tumbled from the rocks above. Jake had discovered the cave years earlier and had used it several times when weather or circumstances required shelter. It was invisible from below and could only be accessed by a treacherous climb that discouraged casual visitors inside the cave. They built a small fire whose smoke was dispersed by the waterfall before it could be seen. Maria opened her herb pouch for the first time since Jake had found her, spreading the sacred plants on a flat rock. In the firelight, Jake could see that each herb had been carefully preserved and wrapped in soft leather. My grandmother was a medicine woman, Maria explained as she sorted through the herbs. These plants, they hold the healing knowledge of our people. She selected several leaves and roots, combining them in a small clay bowl that had also been in the pouch. Adding a little water from their canteens, she began to grind the mixture with a smooth stone. You are hurt, she said, looking up at Jake. Your shoulder. You favor it when you think I am not watching. Jake was surprised by her observation. He had indeed injured his shoulder several months earlier when a spooked horse had thrown him against a fence post. It had never healed properly and still ached during cold weather or after long days in the saddle. It's nothing serious, he protested. But Maria was already approaching with the herbal mixture. This will help, she said simply. My grandmother taught me, please. Jake reluctantly removed his shirt, revealing a shoulder that was indeed swollen and discolored. Maria's hands were gentle but sure as she applied the herbal poultice, securing it with strips of cloth torn from her own dress. Better? She asked after finishing the treatment. Jake moved his shoulder experimentally and was amazed to find that the constant ache had already begun to subside. Much better. Thank you. As they settled down to sleep, Jake found himself thinking about the irony of the situation. Here he was, a white cowboy being healed by Apache medicine, while the territorial government was paying bounties for Apache deaths. The world seemed to have lost all sense of right and wrong. Jake? Maria's voice came softly from across the fire. Yes? When we reach the old camp... What then? I cannot hide forever. It was a question Jake had been avoiding, though he knew it had to be faced eventually. The old Apache camp would provide temporary safety, but it was not a permanent solution. Eventually, the bounty hunters would expand their search. Eventually, someone would get lucky or Maria would make a mistake. I don't know, he admitted. But we'll figure something out. Maybe we can get you across the border into Mexico. There are Apache bands there who would welcome you. Maria was quiet for a long moment. And you? What will happen to you when this is over? Jake stared into the fire, thinking about his former life. His job with the cattle outfit was certainly finished. No rancher would employ a known Apache sympathizer. His reputation in the territory was probably ruined beyond repair. When word got out that he had helped Maria escape, he would become as much of a fugitive as she was. I suppose I'll figure that out when the time comes, he said, but even as he spoke the words, Jake was beginning to realize that he might not want his old life back. These past 2 days had given him The smell of smoke and ash filled the air as Jake and Maria approached the first burned ranch. What had once been the Henderson homestead was now nothing more than charred beams and smoldering rubble. The barn had collapsed completely, and even the well house had been torched. Jake dismounted and walked through the ruins, his boots crunching on broken glass and debris. There were no bodies visible, which gave him hope that the family had escaped before the fire started. But their life's work was gone, reduced to ashes by men who saw suspicion as sufficient evidence for destruction. Over here. Maria called softly from behind what had been the main house. Jake found her kneeling beside a small root cellar that had somehow survived the blaze. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, and voices could be heard coming from within. Hello? Jake called gently. I'm not here to hurt anyone. My name is Jake Morrison. The voices stopped abruptly. After a long moment, the cellar door creaked open wider, and a man's face appeared in the darkness. It was Tom Henderson, a rancher Jake had met several times in town. Tom's face was streaked with soot, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had lost everything. Jake Morrison? What are you doing here? Jake helped Tom climb out of the cellar, followed by his wife Sarah and their 2 young children. The family looked exhausted and terrified, their clothes singed and dirty from hiding in the cramped space. We saw the smoke, Jake explained. Came to see if anyone needed help. Tom's eyes narrowed as he noticed Maria standing nearby. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by fear. That's the Apache girl. The one they're hunting. Sarah Henderson pulled her children closer, her maternal instincts overriding rational thought. Tom, we can't get involved. Look what they've already done to us. Jake understood their fear, but he also knew the Hendersons were decent people who had always treated their neighbors fairly, regardless of race. What happened here, Tom? The rancher's shoulders sagged. Territorial Marshal Briggs and his deputies showed up this morning. Said they had reports that we were harboring Apache fugitives. We told them it wasn't true, but they searched the place anyway. When they didn't find anything, Briggs said we were lying and ordered the place burned as an example. Jake felt his anger rising. Marshal Briggs was known throughout the territory as a brutal man, who used his badge to justify acts of violence that would have landed anyone else in prison. The fact that he was conducting his own personal war against the Apache people was an open secret that the territorial government seemed content to ignore. They took our horses, Tom continued. Said we wouldn't be needing them anymore since we'd be leaving the territory. Gave us 3 days to get out or face arrest. Sarah Henderson was crying now, holding her children close as she stared at the ruins of their home. 20 years we've been here, she whispered. 20 years building something good. Maria stepped forward hesitantly. This is my fault, she said, her English careful but clear. Your family suffers because of me. Tom looked surprised to hear her speak. You talk English? My grandmother taught me. She said it might save my life someday. Maria's voice was heavy with guilt. But now it costs others their lives. Jake shook his head. This isn't about you specifically, Maria. It's about fear and hatred that was here long before you were born. The men who did this were looking for any excuse to drive people off their land. He was right, though none of them wanted to acknowledge it. The territorial authorities had been looking for ways to consolidate control over the best ranching and farming land in the region. The Apache uprising had provided them with the perfect justification for seizing property and driving out anyone who might object to their methods. Where will you go? Jake asked the Hendersons. Tom shrugged helplessly. Sarah has a sister in California, but we've got no money for travel, no horses, no supplies. Everything we owned was in that house. Jake made a decision that he knew would change everything. He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a leather pouch containing most of his life savings, nearly $300. He had been planning to use to buy his own ranch someday. "Take this," he said, pressing the money into Tom's hands. "It's enough to get your family to California and start over." Tom stared at the money in disbelief. "I can't take this, Jake. This is your future you're giving away." "My future's headed in a different direction," Jake replied, glancing at Maria. "But your children need a chance to grow up safe." Sarah Henderson stepped forward and took Jake's hands in hers. "Bless you," she whispered. "We won't forget this kindness." As the Henderson family prepared to leave for the nearest town where they could catch a stagecoach west, Tom pulled Jake aside. "You know they'll be coming for you too, don't you? Briggs will find out you were here, and he'll assume the worst." Jake nodded grimly. "I know. Then why are you doing this?" Jake looked at Maria, who was helping Sarah pack the few belongings they had managed to save from the cellar. "Because someone has to stand up to them. If good people keep running and hiding, the bullies win." After the Hendersons left, Jake and Maria continued through the valley, checking on the other burned ranches. They found similar scenes of destruction at 2 more homesteads, though fortunately the families had escaped before the fires started. At the 3rd ranch, however, they made a disturbing discovery. Fresh horse tracks surrounded the ruins, and the tracks were recent, no more than an hour old. Someone had been here very recently, and given the systematic nature of the search pattern in the dirt, it was almost certainly the bounty hunters. "We need to leave," Jake said urgently. "Now?" But as they turned to go, the sound of gunfire echoed across the valley. Not the random shots of hunters or ranchers, but the disciplined volley fire of men who knew how to fight. Someone was under attack, and from the sound of it, they were outnumbered. Jake wrestled with his conscience for only a moment before spurring Belle toward the sound of battle. Maria didn't protest, though she knew they were riding toward almost certain death. They had come too far and risked too much to abandon their principles now. The gunfight was taking place at the Morrison Creek crossing, where the main road to town forded a shallow stream. Jake recognized the location immediately. It was named after his own family, who had been among the first settlers in the area before moving on to California, hidden behind a ridge overlooking the crossing. They could see the tactical situation clearly. A small wagon was surrounded by 4 mounted men, the same bounty hunters they had encountered before. The wagon's defenders were down to 2 people, one of whom appeared to be wounded. Jake studied the scene through his spyglass and felt his blood run cold. The wagon belonged to Father Miguel Santos, a Spanish priest who ran a small mission church near the Mexican border. Father Santos was known throughout the territory as a man who helped anyone in need, regardless of race or religion. The wounded man beside him was Carlos Vega, a Mexican rancher who often accompanied the priest on his travels. "Why are they attacking a priest?" Maria asked. Jake's jaw tightened. "Because Father Santos has been helping Apache families escape across the border into Mexico. The bounty hunters probably think he knows where you are." The situation was desperate. The priest and his companion were pinned down behind their overturned wagon with limited ammunition, while the bounty hunters had them surrounded and could maintain the siege indefinitely. Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of trying to sneak away, he began working his way around the ridge to get behind the attackers. Maria followed without question. Though she knew this plan was likely to get them both killed, the bounty hunters were so focused on their prey that they never noticed the 2 figures moving through the scrub brush behind them. Jake positioned himself behind a large boulder that gave him a clear view of 3 of the 4 attackers. Maria took cover nearby, armed with a rifle that Jake had taught her to use during their journey. "Hawkins?" Jake called out loudly. This is Jake Morrison. Let the priest go and we'll settle this between us. The scarred bounty hunter spun around in his saddle, his eyes searching for the source of the voice. Morrison! I should have known you'd turn up eventually. You're harboring an Apache fugitive, which makes you a criminal too. The only criminals here are the ones shooting at an unarmed priest, Jake replied. Let him go and face me like a man. Hawkins laughed coldly. I think I'll just kill all of you and collect multiple bounties. The territorial government pays well for dead Apache sympathizers. The gunfight that followed was brief but intense. Jake had the advantage of surprise and superior position, while the bounty hunters had numbers and experience. Maria proved to be a better shot than anyone expected. Her rifle speaking twice before Hawkins even realized she was there when the smoke cleared. 3 of the bounty hunters lay dead and Hawkins himself was badly wounded, his gun hand shattered by one of Maria's bullets. He sat in the dirt, clutching his bleeding arm and glaring at his attackers with undisguised hatred. This isn't over, he snarled. There'll be more coming. You can't fight the whole territorial government. Jake walked over and kicked Hawkins' gun away from his reach. Maybe not. But we can fight the parts of it that have forgotten what justice means. Father Santos emerged from behind the overturned wagon, his robes dusty but his dignity intact. He was a small,